Hello, everybody. Today we're going to be covering section 9.8, which is about invasive species. The learning objective for today is that you can explain the environmental problems associated with invasive species and strategies to control them. Some of the essential knowledge that you're going to gain is what invasive species are, how we see them with generalist versus specialists, R-selected, K-selected, which is a throwback to Unit 3. And then some of the ways that we can control them. So we're going to start with some invasive species basics. Now, what is an invasive species? This is a species that is not native to an area. Often it has been introduced by human transport. So for example, this is the motor of a boat, and it has a bunch of these, they're called zebra mussels, growing on this. And so if this boat were to move from one area to the other, these would be transported and could be introduced to a new area. Now, invasive species do not have any natural predators in the area that they've been introduced. And so there's nothing to control their population and keep their numbers down. They are highly competitive for resources. So they're usually either very fast growers and they can take up a bunch of space and resources, or they're aggressive feeders and they're going to outcompete a lot of the other organisms in the area. And they are able to thrive in their non-native habitat. So you kind of have all of these components that's going to make them invasive. Now, here is another example of pythons, which in a moment we will talk about how pythons are super invasive and you can see them eating local fauna. So if you remember way back in Unit 3, we talked about R-selected versus K-selected and generalist versus specialist species. So usually R-selected and generalist species are more likely to be invasive. Remember that R-selected are the ones that can have tons of offspring, usually less parental control and lots of offspring. And then specialist versus generalist can kind of survive anywhere, which makes sense for invasives. So usually invasives are going to be R-selected and generalist. They have a really high biotic potential and low parental care, and they are highly adaptable to any environment that they might end up being in. They also have diverse habitat and food needs, which means they don't need like a very specific little niche. They can get their food from a wide variety of places. So here's going to be some invasive species that you need to know about. These sometimes will show up on the AP exam. There's some very common examples. So you want to make sure that you specifically know these ones. The first one is zebra mussels, which I just showed you a picture of some zebra mussels on the boat motor in the last slide. Zebra mussels are called zebra mussels because they kind of look like zebras. They are striped in that way. So they are going to be transported by ships in the ballast water. Ballast water is water that gets taken up into the ship. It kind of helps them with their buoyancy. And when they get to certain areas, they'll release that water. And if there's tiny little mussels in there, they're going to be released into the waterway that water's going into. They are very aggressive filter feeders. So they are stationary and they kind of suck out anything in the water that's coming by them. And they can eat algae, which a lot of other species rely on algae as their food source. So if these zebras are very successful at taking a bunch of them in, then they're going to be out competing the other ones. Zebra mussels are also very successful at reproduction. They lay about 1 million eggs per year. So that's a lot of opportunity for their population to grow. If you look here, this is like a pipe. This would be a brand new pipe where zebra mussels were just introduced. 2 months later, this is how many you would have growing. 4 months later, this is how many you would have growing. Within 6 months, you would have this. So like zebra mussels are horrifyingly invasive. They are taking over anywhere that they are introduced, and you can kind of see the level of insanity of how much they take over. Now we also have the kudzu vine, which is originally going to be native to some like Southeast Asia. It was planted in the southern United States to limit soil erosion. Now, as you can see from this picture, they do a lot more than soil erosion protection. They grow super rapidly. They outcompete natives for sunlight. They grow over them. They basically like cover everything. And we don't have anything in the United States that eats them. So there isn't any way to really control it. They take over thousands of acres a year in the southern US. They cover houses, they cover power lines. This vine is like all over the place. So we originally thought that we were bringing it here for some good, and then it just totally took over, which is kind of a common theme sometimes when humans introduce things. Another example of an invasive species is the Asian carp. This was brought in, again, sometimes we intentionally bring these in, not even accidental. It was intentionally brought in to control algae growth in aquatic farms. What happened is it escaped to the Mississippi River, and now it outcompetes native fish for food and space, and it is all over the Mississippi River. Because it outcompetes native fish for food and space, it is leading to decreases in fishery production because we aren't really eating these. We prefer to have the other fish. And so those who are trying to go and catch fish, they're finding that the populations we want are actually dwindling because the Asian carp is everywhere. And so the fishing industry in the Mississippi River takes a hit from these Asian carp taking over. Some more invasive species to know about. The emerald ash borer. This is spread by wood packing materials on ships and planes, and then firewood. So wherever this wood is going, this little bug can go with it. The larva is laid in bark, and then they eat their way out into the phloem, which is like the outer edge of the tree. It's going to disrupt tree nutrients, the nutrient transport. Ultimately, this is going to kill the trees. Now, because of global warming, their range is expanding because they are loving the fact that they have more warmer temperatures to increase into. And so, that's going to be causing even more problems. Then we have the cane toad. The cane toad is actually, probably zebra mussels and cane toads are two of the most famous examples of invasive species. This cute little guy was introduced to eat cane beetles, which were causing sugarcane crop loss in Australia. So again, we intentionally brought it in to try to help prevent these cane beetles ruining the sugarcane industry. They have a massive appetite, and then they became invasive, which then drove declines in other amphibians and small reptiles because they eat them and also because they outcompete them. So another example of humans trying to fix something and making it way worse. And then we have pythons, which I showed you some pictures a couple slides ago. This is a python eating an alligator. Now, pythons clearly are native in some places, but Florida, they are not native. They are very invasive. They were brought to Florida as pets. And then some people decided they no longer wanted a python as a pet, so they just stuck it outside in the wild and figured it's a snake. It should go here. Now, the problem is they decimated mammal populations in the Everglades. Like 90% of some populations were taken out by these. They are super aggressive hunters, as you can see in this terrifying photo, and they don't have any natural predators in Florida. So they are able to just continue living their best life, eating all of the local species. So what is something we can do to actually control invasives? Fun fact, invasives cost the United States about $120 billion per year. This was a 2005 estimate. So it's probably honestly gone up since then. Now, because we have a bunch of consequences from this, we lose agricultural productivity, tourism, property values decline, fisheries decline, and then we end up having to pay to control them and remove them. So all of this together leads to $120 billion in costs per year. So what are some methods that we can use? One method is being able to create laws to prevent the transport of invasives. So for example, firewood for the emerald ash borer, you can have rules where wood is not allowed to go over state lines or be imported to other countries. You can also remove the hosts. So for example, if these emerald ash borers are in dead ash trees, You can remove them, you can burn them, you can take them out to reduce the spread to others. So for example, this is going to be just an educational awareness campaign in Minnesota. And they are showing like, hey, don't move firewood to places. So if you're like bringing your firewood in from another area, you can introduce the emerald ash borer to forests, which can destroy the forests. So education is kind of an option. Another option, especially for our like aquatic ones, you can do careful boat cleaning and inspection, specifically for the zebra mussels. Make sure that you aren't transporting this to all the different lakes that you're going to. We can also do the introduction of natural predators, which is known as biological control. So for example, Chinese wasps eat the emerald ash borer. And so that's something that we can introduce. Keep in mind though, like cane toads were introduced as a biological control. So sometimes we don't always do the best job. There should be extensive research of all of the ecological consequences of introducing certain species because sometimes they end up causing more harm than we thought they would. But theoretically, if you do it right, you can use biological control where you just bring in a predator to eat the problem invasive species. You can also just do physical removal. For example, hunting pythons, just removing them by killing them. You can detach the zebra mussels. You can pull plants out. You can cut trees down. A lot of times this is not going to be your most efficient because sometimes they multiply faster than you can take them out, but it is an option. So this is going to be your practice FAQ for 9.8. You will practice the suggested skill of making a claim that proposes a solution to an environmental problem. So what I want you to do is identify a specific example of an invasive species and propose a solution to limit the spread of that invasive species. So that'll be your practice FAQ for 9.8. Those are your notes on 9.8 about invasive species.